What's up YouTube, capital G here. So today I'm going to be talking a little bit about an icon, a legend, one of the original powerhouses in the game of Yu-Gi-Oh that made us rethink the way we play trap cards. I'm going to be discussing the one and only Jinzo. Whether newer players realize this or not, Jinzo is easily one of the most important monster cards released in the entire Duel Monsters era, and whether you were watching Joey and Esperoba kick butt during the Battle City arc, or like me, you were just getting your butt kicked by it at locals, chances are you revered the card and recognized its power. With all those introductions out of the way, I am proud to present the rise and fall of Jinzo. Life and Times of Mr. J. I say this in every Yu-Gi-Oh story, but more so than any card I've covered so far, to fully understand how monumental Jinzo was upon release, we have to go back to the original Duel Monsters era. This is over 15 years ago, late fall 2002. Since Jinzo was released in Yu-Gi-Oh's 4th booster set, the game was very different, much simpler, and real-life Yu-Gi-Oh actually resembled the anime, as battling was by far the most popular way of dealing with your opponent's monsters. As you might expect, this type of meta was very similar to what I often refer to as caveman Yu-Gi-Oh, and equipped spells like Axe of Despair were very popular and worth their weight in gold. Also, because there weren't many complex strategies and cards, it meant that the inherent power level of monsters was incredibly low. Monsters with built-in protection were essentially unheard of at the time. In fact, a lot of vanilla level 4 1800 attack monsters like Lejeune, the mystical genie of the lamp, 7-colored fish, and Harpy's brother were actually considered fantastic cards and were used competitively at the time. This led to a game where the simplest of trap cards like Trap Hole and of course the all-powerful Mirror Force could be used at near staple status as a primary means of stopping your opponent's big monsters from ever mounting a legitimate board presence. Absolute power. When Jinzo was released in Pharaoh's Servant, it should go without saying that it flipped the entire game of Yu-Gi-Oh on its head overnight. First off, he had the protection from those powerful trap cards like Mirror Force and Trap Hole. It should be noted that this alone put the card in a league of its own, but in addition to that, he actually had the amazing stats to drop the hammer on your opponent at any given time. While 2500 had previously been the gold standard because of Metal Raider Skull Servant, he was just a vanilla beater that offered raw strength. Jinzo, on the other hand, offered legitimate utility and even locked down miles ahead of what Summon Skull could ever dream of, and for the cost of only 100 attack points. Jinzo's great stats didn't just stop there, however, because it had exactly 1500 defense. This meant that Jinzo was searchable from Witch of the Black Forest as well. This became even more valuable of a resource as it took Konami less than 2 months to realize that Jinzo had become the first great competitive boss monster in the game, and the card was limited, the one on the December 2002 ban list. One of the reasons Jinzo was such a powerful card is because as Konami started giving us more powerful trap cards, ones that made extending upon your field even more risky, like Labyrinth of Nightmares Torrential Tribute, or even traps that held the power to turn your opponent's monsters into their very own demise, like Pharaonic Guardian's Ring of Destruction or Magic Cylinder, which was also released in Labyrinth of Nightmare. Jinzo's power would inherently rise. As stated before, the built-in protection from all traps was exclusive to this card during the DM era, so with every new set, Jinzo just added more cards to the list of things that he had conquered. Adaptable android. During most of the DM era, Jinzo had almost no competition when it came to competitively viable one-tribute monsters. Most of the time, he was head and shoulders better than his competition. There were a couple of cards that came close, like Legacy of Darkness's Air Knight Parashaft or Vampire Lord from Dark Crisis, but overall, Jinzo was still the top dog by far. But by the time the GX era rolled around, the days of 1800 vanillas in the main deck were dead, and players were used to playing complex control decks of all effect monsters. This is where Jinzo really set himself apart from almost every tribute monster from the DM era. While cards like Vampire Lord and Air Knight Parashaft were completely power creeped by the advent of Cyber Dragon, Jinzo actually found a home alongside the card in many of GX's best aggressive and control decks. While this might not sound like a big feat, please keep in mind that outside of Dark Magician of Chaos, whose competitive play absolutely skyrocketed with the release of Phantom Darkness, almost none of the DM era tributes were good enough to carry over competitively to the GX era. The Monarchs were technically released in the DM sets, but they never actually saw play in that era, so I don't really count them. The reason Jinzo was able to keep up during GX while while so many others failed was actually quite different than its original use. During DM, Jinzo was seen as one of the safest summons in the game, alongside things like Sangan and Witch of the Black Forest, reliable attack values, and incredibly hard to punish. However, in GX, Jinzo was often used as the green light to OTK your opponent. The GX era was notoriously known for lots of explosive OTKs, and Jinzo was the perfect tool to facilitate all of them. Diamond Dude Turbo, Machines, the Destiny Hero Beatdown aka T-Hero, Dad Return. Go back and look at some of the most explosive decks from the GX era and you'll spot Jinzo in almost every single one of them. Jinzo's lockdown of traps made it perfect for OTKing, but its makeup made it perfect for those decks. It was Dark for Allure of Darkness, Machine for Future Fusion and Limiter removal plays. Level 6 also worked really well with cards like Reasoning that was popularized by the Diamond Dude Turbo deck. Jinzo was already an icon, but thanks to its special gifts, this card spent the entire era being a highly valuable card in some of the best and most successful decks in the game competitively. Exit stage left. When the 5Ds era was upon us, as Teledad won its first of many Shonen Jump championships, it was very apparent that the game was going to be very synchro focused. This is where Jinzo lost a lot of its value. During the 5Ds era, outside of Lightsworn, if you weren't a monster that had some type of synergy or was very useful when it came to synchro summoning, you probably were not going to see a lot of meta play. Very similar to why Light and Darkness Dragon fell out of favor, tribute monsters that couldn't inherently summon themselves didn't fare all that well over the next couple of eras. Cards like Malicious, the Dragon Rulers, Quick Draw Synchron, High Priestess of Prophecy, these cards all worked because they didn't require you to use your normal summon on them and they could all be special summoned inherently, whether from the hand or the deck. In addition, these cards could easily accommodate extra deck summoning mechanics like Synchro and Xyz summons where the game was naturally progressing. Jinzo was released during the DM era, so it didn't really have any synergy with the newer mechanics and players were not very favorable to this. Jinzo didn't actually lose much of its inherent power despite the release of more cards that could actually stop its summon entirely like Solemn Warning from Duelist Revolution, but it just didn't fit the meta at all. Called a cruel stroke of fate, but it actually ended up being a card like Caius the Shadow Monarch that was more adept to be used as the one lone oddball tribute monster sometimes seen in 5D's decks like Plant Synchro and Teledad. It wasn't that these decks couldn't incorporate Jinzo, it just didn't really make much sense. They did have tribute fodder, Malicious, Dandelion Token, Spore, Glow Up Bulb, etc. It's just Jinzo didn't really actually fit the meta and it didn't offer that much value. Caius on the other hand was a natural out to basically every synchro monster in the game, as well as opposing Dandelion, Sangan, Glow Up Bulb, etc. A lot of annoying floating monsters would just go bye-bye with Caius, and sometimes you'd end up getting 1,000 damage, which could be significant if your opponent had used Solemn Judgment earlier in the duel. Now that's not to say that Caius had any more natural synergy with synchro summoning than Jinzo did, it just did more in the context of the 5D's era, and people were willing to give it more of a chance than they would ever Jinzo. My heart will carry on. Despite the game in many formats moving towards hand traps being played over actual traps, that in theory should put Jinzo at an all-time low when it comes to competitive viability, Jinzo greatly benefited from the pendulum mechanic, which gave many decks the ability to instantly summon the card from the hand without the reliance of the normal summon or tributing, which obviously makes it incredibly easy to get on the field. While Jinzo has not seen any widespread main deck play in the meta in over a decade, the card can still be excellent against many of the newer decks that are heavily reliant on traps. I'm looking at you, Paleozoic and Altergeist. So while Jinzo's best days may be behind it, it still lives on as a very viable side deck option. This of course is format dependent, and if you can actually believe this, Jinzo has shown up periodically in side decks, kind of like over the last decade. It's a card that is always pretty viable, just I feel like its main deck days, those are kind of in the past. So let me know what you guys thought of this Yu-Gi-Oh story. I actually remember Jinzo very fondly. It's one of one of the cards that I really do love. Quick story, I remember the first time I ever saw a Jinzo in real life. The first time the card was ever summoned against me, I was 16 years old and my opponent went the tribute summon. He summoned Jinzo. I flipped over Trap Hole and I was like, yes, I got him. He tapped on the card and said, and I thought to myself, wait, what? I read it and man, I was absolutely flabbergasted by the card. Jinzo, it really is kind of hard to explain just how powerful this card was to newer players, but I mean, just take it for what it was. Jinzo was one of the most powerful monsters in the game, bar none, when it was released, and it was easily the best boss monster in the game. I mean, when a card gets limited to 1 after 2 months of being in the game, you know it's pretty damn powerful. So let me know what you guys thought. Leave it in the comment section below. Thank you guys for watching. As always, subscribe if you have not already. Turn on that notification bell for daily videos.